Welcome to NES's CUPA Training Requirements webinar. Now, a copy of this webinar is available to be downloaded. You can see here the web address, nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads. So if you would like a copy of this webinar, we do have a copy available for you to be downloaded. With that, we will go ahead and begin. My name is Steve Reichow. I'm an instructor here with NES. I will be your presenter for this presentation. And again, welcome. We appreciate you attending this presentation. So the objective of today's webinar is to cover the employee training requirements for those environmental and emergency programs that are overseen and enforced by your Certified Unified Program agencies or the CUPAs for regulated businesses throughout the state of California. So we will cover what training elements have to be provided, but this webinar will not satisfy any of the discussed or required training elements. It is merely to share with you what training requirements your facility and employees may be subject to. So we're going to cover 5 topics. First, we're going to look at applicable training requirements for hazardous waste generators, and we will cover the training requirements whether your facility is a small quantity generator or a large quantity generator. Also, we will cover training requirements for those facility personnel who are considered to be universal waste managers. So we'll cover small, large quantity hazardous waste generator requirements, as well as training requirements for universal waste managers. Then we will discuss the training requirements for facilities that are subject to the Hazardous Material Business Plan, or HMBP requirements. Following that, we'll look at the training requirements for oil handling personnel if your facility is subject to the Aboveground Petroleum Storage Act, or APSA. Then we will look at training requirements for California Accidental Release Prevention facilities, or CalARP facilities. And we will look at training requirements whether your facility is a Program 2, Program 3, or Program 4 facility. Then we will conclude with training requirements for those facilities that store hazardous materials in underground storage tanks. So the first training requirements we're going to cover are for those facilities who are considered to be hazardous waste generators. Now, in California, your generator status is based on the amount of hazardous waste, which includes federally regulated RCRA and state regulated or non-RCRA hazardous waste. And depending how much of non-acute, non-extreme hazardous waste, and or acute or extremely hazardous waste determines your generator status. So we have small and large quantity generators, and we will begin with the training requirements for small quantity generators. Then we'll look at those training requirements for large quantity generators, and we will conclude this section for the universal waste handler training requirements. So small quantity generators. Training requirements are outlined in federal regulations, 40 CFR Part 262.16. And what is required of small quantity generators is that employees must be trained so they are familiar with proper waste handling and emergency response procedures relevant to their responsibilities. Now, within these federal regulations for small quantity generators, there is nothing that identifies when initial training has to be provided and or refresher training requirements. However, it is recommended at a minimum that training be provided annually as a best management practice. Within these regulations, there's also nothing that mandates or requires documentation or records of employees who handle or manage hazardous waste of recording the training. However, again, it is recommended as a best management practice that if you are a small quantity generator, that you maintain records or documentation that your employees have been trained. Now, for large quantity generators, training requirements are spelled out in state regulations, Title 22 California Code of Regulations, Part 66265.16. The training requirements for large quantity generators are more specific than those of small quantity generators, and it actually states in state regulations that facility personnel must successfully complete a program of classroom instruction or on-the-job training. And training must cover hazardous waste management procedures and then those contingency plan implementation requirements relevant to their positions. And the contingency plan reference here is specific for responding to a spill, release, fire, or explosion involving hazardous waste. So for large quantity generators, training requirements are spelled out in state regulations, Title 22. Employees must complete a classroom on-the-job training specific to hazardous waste management and emergency response procedures relevant to their positions. And initial training for these employees must be provided within 6 months of job hire and placement. And then annual training also must be provided for the affected employees. Now, there are requirements for records and what has to be included for training or documentation of these employees. What must be included is the employee's job title, job description of type and amount of initial and annual training, and then documentation of training or job experience for these employees. These records for current facility personnel who manage or handle hazardous waste as part of their job duty must be maintained until the facility closes. Now, any former employees who receive training, the documentation must be maintained for those employees for at least 3 years from the date they last worked at the facility. So for large quantity generators, training requirements spelled out in state regulations, much more defined than those requirements for employees who work at small quantity generator facilities. Now for universal waste handlers, training requirements are also spelled out in state regulations, Title 22 CCR Part 66273.36. Now, for universal waste handlers, only those employees who manage universal waste are subject to the training requirements. Now, employees who manage universal waste are not necessarily the employees who generate the universal waste, but they are specifically the employees who are responsible for consolidating, sorting, treating, recycling, packaging universal waste for transport, offering universal waste for transport, or physically relocating containers of universal waste within your facility. So for universal waste handlers, only those employees who perform these job duties associated with universal waste are subject to the training requirements. Employees that simply generate universal waste would not necessarily be considered a universal waste manager and would not be subject to these training requirements. So for universal waste managers, what is required of those employees is that they be trained on the types of universal waste that are managed at the facility where the waste are generated and the hazards associated with those universal wastes. They also must be trained on proper disposition of universal waste at their facility, procedures for responding to any releases involving the universal waste, and the labeling, collecting, handling, consolidating, and shipping of the universal waste generated at their facility. Now, handlers must be provided initial training and training annually thereafter. The facility also must retain written records that includes the training date the universal waste manager was trained, and those records must be retained for at least 3 years from the date the person last managed universal waste. So for universal waste handlers, those employees who manage universal waste, they have to have the materials or the training provided initially and annually thereafter. All right, with that, we will now talk about hazardous materials business plan and the training requirements that are required for facilities that are subject to prepare and implement a hazardous material business plan. Now, these training requirements for facility personnel are not spelled out in state regulations, but rather in the Health and Safety Code, section 25505, paragraph A4. And what is required for facilities that are required to develop and implement a hazardous material business plan is that all employees are trained. Now, there are 4 training requirements specified within the Health and Safety Code for these employees at facilities subject to the Hazardous Material Business Plan statutes. The first element is safety procedures in the event of a release or a threatened release of a hazardous material. Employees also must be trained in notification contacts, procedures for mitigation of a release or threatened release of a hazardous material to minimize harm to people, property, or the environment, and evacuation procedures specific to the facility operations. So if your facility has a business plan, all employees must be trained, and these 4 elements must be covered for those employees. Now, additionally, employees must be trained initially and then annually thereafter. Also, records must be maintained for 3 years for all employees at your facility who have received training to satisfy the Hazardous Material Business Plan statute. Now, while all employees are required to receive training, for the training program that you develop and implement, you can take into consideration the position of each employee. So while we have those 4 specified elements, not all employees are necessarily going to receive the same level of training for all of these elements because it could be specific, or you could consider the employee's specific position within your organization. So some employees may not be expected to respond to a spill release, but they would still have to know who must be notified or the evacuation procedures. So those are some considerations that you may want to take into hand before you develop and provide the HMBP training, for your facility. All right, the next training element is for those facilities that are subject to the Aboveground Petroleum Storage Act or APSA. So facilities that are subject to APSA are defined as tank facilities. And these tank facilities, what they must do is develop and implement what is referred to as a spill prevention control and countermeasure plan. Now, the SPCC requirements are spelled out in federal regulations in 40 CFR Part 112. And those facilities that are subject to APSA and must prepare and implement an SPCC plan in accordance with these federal regulations also must provide training for oil handling personnel. Now, oil handling personnel at an APSA facility must be trained on operation and maintenance of equipment to prevent any discharges. These employees also must be trained on discharge procedures, pollution control laws, rules and regulations, facility operations, and then contents of the site-specific spill prevention control and countermeasurement plan. Now, the SPCC plan, unlike the Hazardous Material Business Plan, only addresses under APSA petroleum, specifically petroleum that is stored in above ground storage tanks that have the capacity to store 55 gallons or more of petroleum products. Under the federal regulations, in 40 CFR Part 112, the SPCC addresses the storage of oil in above ground storage tanks. So the SPCC elements noted here, operation and maintenance of equipment, discharge procedures, pollution control laws, rules and regulations, facility operations, contents of the SPCC plan are specific to those above ground storage tanks that store petroleum under APSA and oil under federal regulations. And the intent is to prevent a spill release of the petroleum or oil to a body of water within the state of California. Now, for oil handling personnel, the training must be provided at least once per year. Now, as a recommendation, records for the training for oil handling personnel should be maintained with the SPCC plan for 3 years. So you want to ensure that these employees that would be considered oil handling personnel receive training at least once per year, and then the training records are maintained with the SPCC plan for 3 years. Next, we'll look at training requirements for facilities that are subject to the California Accidental Release Prevention Program, or CalARP. So for CalARP, we have 3 different levels: Program 2, Program 3, and Program 4. The training requirements for these 3 programs are fairly consistent, but they are not necessarily one and the same with the elements and or the documentation or the record keeping requirements. So we'll look at each of these programs and what must be covered dependent on which program you may be subject to. So for Program 2 facilities, training requirements are spelled out in state regulations, Title 19, California Code of Regulations, Part 2755.4. And employees that operate a covered process must be trained on the following elements: initial startup, normal operations, temporary operations, normal shutdown, emergency shutdown, startup following shutdown, and then equipment inspections. And again, these training elements are not for all operations at a facility, but specifically only those covered processes which are subject to CalARP. So if your process is not covered under CalARP, your employees that operate these systems would not necessarily need to be trained on these elements. It's only for those covered processes. Now, employees must be trained or tested competent initially. So there is a means, rather than actually train these employees, where they could test competent on performing the operations that were formally mentioned. So if they test competent on the operations associated with a covered process, that could be or meet the initial training requirements. Now, refresher training for these employees that operate a covered process must be provided at least every 3 years. Training could be provided more frequently, but at a minimum, at least every 3 years. And then both for your initial and refresher training for these employees, the training must be documented. So you have to have records, documentation that the employees have met both initial and refresher training requirements. So for Program 3, training requirements are spelled out again in state regulations, Title 19, California Code of Regulations, Part 2760.4. And again, the training only applies to those employees that operate a process covered by CalARP. So for those employees that operate a process that is covered by CalARP, the training must cover steps for each operating phase, the operating limits any safety and health considerations of the covered process, safety systems and functions of the covered process must also be covered for these employees. And like Program 2, employees must be trained initially. Refresher training must be provided at least every 3 years. So initial training, refresher training at least every 3 years, and training must be documented. Now, the documentation for Program 3, facilities and those employees that operate a covered process has to include the employee's name, the date the initial and/or refresher training was provided, and the means used to verify that the employee understood the training specific to this covered process. So we have specific elements that must be included as part of the documentation if your facility is a Program 3 facility. Now, Program 4 facilities, training requirements are also spelled out in state regulations. Again, Title 19, California Code of Regulations, and the training requirements are in Section 2762.4. And this training, again, is specific for those employees that operate a process that is covered under CalARP. And the elements that must be covered for these employees that operate a covered process, again, is steps for each operating phase, operating limits, safety and health consideration, safety systems, and then functions of the covered operation. Now, like the other programs, Program 2 and Program 3, employees must be trained initially, and then refresher training must be provided at least every 3 years. The difference for documentation of training for Program 4 facilities is that you actually need a certification record. And the certification record must include the employee's name who received the training, the date the training was provided, means used to verify the employee understood the training, and then you also have to include the name of the person who administered or provide the training for those employees who operate a covered process for Program 4 CalARP facilities. Now, the last section that we're going to look at for those employee training requirements are for facilities that have underground storage tanks that are used to store hazardous materials. So if your facility has a UST used to store a hazardous material, employees that are responsible for operating that UST system must be trained per state regulations spelled out in Title 23, California Code of Regulations, Section 2715, paragraph F. And these employees that are responsible for operating a UST system must be trained by a designated UST operator. So there is a specific specification or certification for those employees that are providing training for employees who operate a UST system. So the training specifically has to be provided by a UST designated operator, typically referred to as a DO. And the employees must be trained on proper operation of the underground storage tank, their specific role regarding monitoring of that UST system. These employees also must be trained on the facility's response plan. So if there is a failure to the UST system, an alarm sounds, what the facility's response procedures are, in their specific role as part of responding to a failure alarm for their UST system. Employees also must be trained on name of contact person or persons for emergencies and then monitoring the equipment alarms. So employees that operate a UST system must be trained on these elements, operation, their role, response plan specific to facility operations, name a contact person for emergencies, and monitoring equipment alarms. And training must specifically be provided by a designated UST operator. Now, these employees who are subject to the UST training requirement must be trained within 30 days of hire and every 12 months thereafter. Additionally, facilities that have USTs must have a list of employees that have been trained by the designated operator, and this list must be maintained on site at all times. Now, what was not included or referenced in any of these training requirements were specific duration or other than UST operator training, necessarily the specific certification for who must provide these training programs. So there is some latitude regarding the specific duration, content in some cases, such as for small and large quantity generators, is pretty ambiguous. Operations handling hazardous waste and emergency response procedures, so there is some latitude there. And in other cases, such as the business plan and CalARP facility training requirements, it is very specific. So there is some latitude. The important thing, though, is any of these programs that your facility may be subject to, you want to ensure that you have developed, implemented, and provided the appropriate training for affected facility personnel, that training has been documented and you maintain records at your facility, because when you were inspected by the CUPA, which at a minimum, if you have a business plan in place, will be at least once every 3 years, depending on the jurisdiction. It could be more frequently. What the CUPA inspector will look at, in addition to your facility operations, is the specific records for each one of those programs and specifically the training requirements. So you want to make sure you have training that meets these specified elements and you maintain those records on site. And again, if you would like to download a copy of this presentation, you could access a copy at nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads.